Or to mistake the gift that God has given us as a possession. Y'all with me? Let me say it again. It's about gifts and it's about limit. The Creator has given us a tremendous gift, but we also have the responsibility not to take too much of it. All right? Nor to mistake the gift that He has given us as a possession. It's not a possession, it's a gift. So the economic implications of all of this are articulated in the Bible and summarized in this way. I'm not going to keep you long. The world, as created by God, is abundant. Everybody say abundant. With enough for everyone, provided that the human communities restrain their appetites and live within limits. And see, this is going to hit hard with some of us because we swallowed the poison. We swallowed the Kool-Aid. And we've got it in our DNA that we got to accumulate all of this stuff and it all belongs to me. Amen. Get as much as you can. Come on now. Listen. The second part of this is there are disparities in wealth and power that we see now are not natural. Let me say that again. The disparities that we see every day between wealth and power are not natural. And we witness them because they are the result of human sin. And God did not intend for there to be such a disparity between wealth and power in His creation. That's not what He intended. And it came about as a result of the sin of human beings. And we have a responsibility to mitigate it within the community of faith through the regular practice of redistribution. Let me slow my roll right here, because if I don't want to move forward if you don't understand that. I'm not saying you have to agree with it, but I want to know if you understand it. Give me a head nod if you do. If you don't, I'll go back over it again. In other words, let me say, can we agree that there's a lot of disparity between wealth and power in this world? Not just in the U.S., but in this world, right? And maybe even right here in Chappell. Come on, talk to me. Can we agree that it is not natural that God didn't plan it that way? Can we agree with that? Y'all talk to me now. So therefore, if we can agree on that, then we can agree that it must be mitigated within our community of faith. In other words, we must be found trying to do something about it to change the disparity of wealth and power that we see around us, because that's not what God intended to be. And the way to deal with it is through the practice of redistribution. In other words, we got to distribute some of this stuff around so that everybody have a little bit of it. The economic implication, the next one is that the prophetic message that we get from the Bible calls people to practice such redistribution and is thus characterized as the good news to the poor. You know, we've heard that. You know, I come to give good news to the poor. Well, what good news you going to give them? The good news that we can give them is that, hey, you're going to get a little bit of the pie like everybody else is getting some. Amen. Do you not realize we don't have to have this level of poverty? And I know somebody going to come back and say, Jesus said the poor you're going to always have with you. That's because we have turned to the human sin and don't want to redistribute any of the stuff that we've accumulated. If I sound angry, I am. This whole thing about Sabbath economics and its purpose of regular, systematic wealth and power redistribution is summed up in the whole idea of Jubilee. Anybody ever heard of Jubilee? If you haven't, raise your hand. Okay, Jubilee. Jubilee has to do with the release of slaves, going back to when the Hebrews were enslaved in Egypt. Jubilee happens once every what? 50 years. And it has to do with the release of slaves. It has to do with the deconstruction of debt. And it has to do with the return of foreclosed land. In other words, every 50 years, there's a turnover. There's a redistribution of the wealth so that everybody can have at least a little bit of it. If your land was gone, it should come back to you. If you got a whole lot of debt, that debt should be reconstructed so that you're not slaving under debt. Many of us in this room right now are slave to debt. Oh, I hear you. I ain't no slave. Yeah, you are. And let me help somebody in here. If you don't pay off that credit card balance, by the time it's time to pay it off, that interest is going to kill you. And all you're going to end up doing is paying interest and never on the principal. That is a form of slavery. You may not have slavery, you may not have handcuffs, you may not have shackles on your feet, you may not have shackles on your arm, but if you got a whole lot of debt and you're swimming in debt, you got shackles on your mind and you got shackles on your behind because somebody owns you. Y'all ought to come on and walk with me in here. Jubilee came from the Hebrew experience of slavery in Egypt, and Sabbath economics is both corrective and preventative. And in this day, it offers us, the community of faith, a way out of this historical and persistent slavery to the debt system. Let me give you a little bypass story. My mother was in an assisted living facility. That's what she wanted to go there. She wanted to go. So she called me, and Judge Brown, Judge Brown can tell you this is true. My mother called me, and when she called me by my first name, I know there's trouble on the line. She started off talking. Most of the time, she just started off telling you what she wanted. No, but when she say Greg, and then start talking, I know that there's some trouble somewhere. So what my mom did, she had got this credit card. This unsecured credit card. Here she is, late 70s, got terminal cancer, and they gave her unsecured credit card. Yeah. So what did she do? She took that unsecured credit card, I think it had about $500 limit on it, something like that, and went to Biloxi, Mississippi. Some of y'all trying to act all holy in here, y'all know where Biloxi is, and y'all know what goes on in Biloxi. So she blew that thing up. And then come calling me because what had happened was they were calling her every day about paying that debt. Every day. So she got, Greg, you need to come up here. So I went up to Statesville, and I'm sitting there, phone, and true enough, the phone rang while I was there. And the young person on the other side of the phone, my mother put me on the phone. I told them who I was, identified myself. They said, well, the debt is about $1,200. I said, okay. That's my go-to word, okay. And she said, but if you will give us $900 right now, we'll call it even. I said, ma'am, I ain't giving you nothing. First of all, I don't have the debt. It's not me. My name's not on there. He said, well, your mother's name is on there. I said, yeah, but she's not going to give you nothing. They said, why not? I said, because she don't have nothing to give you. You the one was crazy enough to send her an unsecured credit card. She don't have anything to get. She don't work. She's terminally ill. She don't have anything. Well, we're going to call her every day. I say, no, you're not. So I hung up the phone. So they called back. And we're going back and forth. So I called Judge Brown. Judge Brown said, tell you what you do. You call the Attorney General and tell them about it. And I called the Attorney General, and she said to tell them that you called the Attorney General. And what had happened, they had sold the debt to another company. And the third party, and all they wanted to do was call and harass you. So I got so mad, I asked the girl, I said, where are you? She said, I'm in San Bernardino. I said, I'm coming out there. She said, come on. And that's when Charlotte told me to call the Attorney General. And when I told them to call the Attorney General, they left alone. There was no way she was going to pay that. But she had become a slave to debt. Sabbath economics is unfamiliar to most of us because the writers and interpreters of the word chose to remain silent about it. They just didn't want to write about it because they didn't like the whole idea of Jubilee. They didn't like the turning over. They didn't like giving the stuff back. So they just went bypass it. And the silence allowed us to not know about it. The interpreters were skeptical of Jubilee and painted it as being irrelevant, painted it as being unrealistic and threatening. And they claimed they couldn't find nothing about it in either the New or the Old Testament. That's why we don't know that much about Jubilee. Amen. That's why we don't know that much about Sabbath economics. They said they couldn't find it. But Wayne Meeks said that our theological imaginations have long been captive to the market of capitalism. That's why we don't want to find it in the Word. I'm glad y'all asked. Capitalism is an economic system that we live in, especially in this country, where private people can come together and have businesses and companies, and they produce the tools and all the goods and stuff that we buy, and it's not done by the government. And there's a lot of competition in it, and they can raise the prices and what to, and it's dependent on supply and demand and all of that. But in Sabbath economics, this whole thing about redistribution, people in capitalism don't want to hear that. Amen. It's too much. It's too much like socialism, where the government run it. And be honest with you, I don't want the government running it either. But I think there ought to be a fair way to deal inside a capitalistic economy so that everybody can have a little something. Amen. It don't make sense for teachers who are charged with teaching your children how to walk and chew gum at the same time, got to go out here and work 3 jobs. When they going to have time to grade papers? And then turn around, you take their assistants away. They don't even have enough help to handle the 26 to 30 kids that they got in the class all day. And you expect them to have a learning situation. And then we got parents who are breathing down their back. And rather than listening to the teacher, and I get it, then they want to go and jump on the teacher. I wish it would have been like that when I was a kid. Because if my teacher called my mama, I know it was on and popping when I got home. She didn't want to hear anything I had to say. But that thing has really turned over now. So the preeminent challenge to a human family in our time is the continuing, growing, unequal distribution of wealth and power. And hear me clearly. Any church, any religious group, any church, any way you want to say it, including Chappell, any church that refuses to wrestle and reckon with the reality of this wealth and power disparity is both cruel and irrelevant. If we don't grab hold of this thing, then we're just as bad as the system itself. Because our word teaches us that we have to deal with it. There's another way. Let me run this down for you. Maybe this will wake somebody up, since y'all don't want to walk with me tonight. 2% of the people in this country control 98% of the resources. And I'm looking around. Ain't nobody in the 2% in this room. I come to speak truth to power tonight. Think about that. 2% of the people in this country control 98% of the resources. The water, the electricity, the gas, the food. Do you realize that they are really trying to shut down the local farmers? And they want these big agricultural conglomerates? Why? So they can control the food. And we destroy more food than you can shake a stick at, that they could distribute or redistribute to the hungry. And they pay farmers not to grow certain foods. Y'all ought to come on and walk with me. Did you know that? And somebody asked me why. Because they can. And because it helps them to control and keep us begging at the door. I'm not through. Then flip that. 98% of the people control only 2% of the resources. 98%, we're part of that group. But we only control 2% of the resources in this land. Y'all ought to be mad right now. If that don't get you, how about this one? The wealthiest 20% of the world's population receives almost 83% of the world's income. I think I put that in your note. 20% of the people have the lion's share of the income in this world. 20% of the people in the world receive less than 2% of the income. Y'all awful quiet. I didn't come here to try to make you feel good. I want to wake us up. 1965. I don't really remember what I was doing in 1965, but I was born. Yeah, let's see. I was 9 years old. 1965. Good year. The average worker in these ununited states of America was making $7.52 an hour in 1965. Huh? Your mom and dad got married? So your dad was making $7.52 an hour? Oh, he made, okay. The average person, the average laborer made $7.52 an hour in 1965. While the person running the company, the CEO, as they call him, or COO, was making $330.38 an hour. Now, they sitting up there in a desk, nice crisp white shirt on. At that time, they were wearing ties and suits and all that kind of stuff. And just signing some papers while you down there working in fiberglass and all kinds of stuff. Making $330 an hour. Y'all awful quiet. Now, fast forward to 2026. The average worker in 2026 is making $7.25 an hour. Somebody get this. Y'all get this before we get out of here. $7.25 an hour. In 1965, they were making $7.52 an hour. We have regressed the average worker, but not the CEO. The average CEO is making $1,566.68 an hour. $212 times more than the average worker per hour. So increasingly becoming richer on the backs of the poor. And whether through plant and business closings, the demise of the local grocery, the crisis of the family farm, we are witnessing an epidemic of communal displacement and already devastated local culture, local communities, institutions like HBCUs, environments the world over. And so we have a duty to talk about economics in the light of the gospel. I know it's hard times. It's hard times to march, this march of global capitalism, and it's not just in this country, but it's all over the world. The disparities are getting wider and wider and wider. But it's a good time for the church to understand this whole thing about Sabbath economics so that we can help address this thing, because the Bible recognizes that inequalities will inevitably arise in a fallen society. Right? The Bible recognizes that, and the Bible refuses to accept that injustice is therefore a permanent condition. It only becomes a permanent condition when we sit around and do nothing. We are instructed by the Bible to dismantle on a regular basis any of the patterns and structures of stratified wealth and power, because we must fight that there is enough for everyone. Some of you may have heard, I know last year was really big. We were talking about 15, I forgot the slogan, but it was trying to bump up the minimum wage to $15 an hour. You really need to be making almost $30-some an hour just to afford a one-bedroom apartment in Charlotte. God, the whole thing about social economic justice is captured in the first 5 books of the Bible. The Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of law, the 5 books of Moses, that's what it's called. And it's grounded in the word of keep the Sabbath. We've always heard that. Anybody heard that? Keep the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Right. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means, as Reverend Stewart said a while ago, rest. It means to stop working. And it appears, now watch where it appears in the Bible. It appears in the Bible at the end of creation. At the end of creation. After creating the world, God said it is good. The Hebrew word for that is tov, which simply means delightful and incredible. When God looked out at what he had done, you know, he said, tov, it's good. It's incredible. It's amazing. And the world, and let me help somebody here. I don't care what we do, the world cannot be improved by human hands. The world is already abundant. The world is already satisfying, and the world is already magical. God did a great thing. And he don't need you to improve on it. And he culminated by saying it is good. And he rested on the 7th day. God's work is followed by Sabbath, followed by rest, right? But Sabbath is not for the purpose of resting in order to do more work. Y'all come on and walk with me. God didn't do Sabbath in order to do more work. In other words, you can look as much as you want. There ain't no Monday that followed Sabbath when God created the world. God created it like he wanted it, and he wants us to enjoy it abundantly and forever. So there was nothing else to be done about that. That's our response, is to enjoy it and see it as the gift for what it is. And then we are to imitate God in practicing Sabbath. You know, when the Hebrews came out of slavery, the only thing they were used to was the economy of the Egyptians, and how the Egyptians were political, how they were militaristic, and how they were technologically advanced, you know, and that's the only thing they knew, just like black folk. When we come over here and we get out the plantation, that's all we knew is how white folk did things. Y'all walking with me? Yeah, but the Hebrew said, you should have left us in Egypt. We could have died over there, but you led us out to the desert to die out here. But watch what God did. You remember, some of y'all are familiar with the story about manna, right? They were hungry, they were fussing, they were grumbling, and then God decided to send bread, right? But let's be clear, the manna story is not about a feeding miracle. The manna story is not about a morality tale about trust. But the most important lesson from the manna story is about following instructions. Rain, bread was raining from heaven, symbolizes the fertility of a divine gift. A process that began with rain and ended up with bread. Think about that. Rain came, then the bread came, and then later in the evening the meat came. Look at God. The manna then is a test to see if we can follow instructions. And that is on how to gather the gift that God has given. Amen, lights. So the first lesson that the children of Israel had to learn when they came out of Egypt was what kind of lesson? Huh? I couldn't hear you. Follow instructions. But what was the first lesson, though? It was an economic. From this parable about the whole idea that we are to hunt, we are to gather, and we are to do local horticulture. And the difference between local horticulture and agriculture has to do with big conglomerate kind of stuff. Like growing big old fields of soybeans and all this kind of thing. Horticulture, local horticulture is doing these local gardens so that we can have fresh fruit and fresh fruits and fresh vegetables and that kind of thing. And the instruction in the text provide these practices.